did a live stream yesterday that got a certain amount of attention, and there were some comments and questions that I got from people. So I thought I would try to revisit some of that and try to make sense of the historical parallels that I brought up, particularly the ones that deal with the 1960s and the 1970s and with civil rights in general. But also there is other research that I've been doing recently on more ancient history, and particularly the end of the Roman Empire, that I think is also very useful. Hopefully I'm going to be having Rachel Alexander joining here shortly. Right now, what I want to do is I'm just going to put the feeds on my Twitter account so that I can make sure that as many people as possible get to see this. I think that right now it is hard because when you're in the middle of it, it's hard to keep track of the fact that we are actually living through history and we're part of history right now. So therefore, a lot of the details that can seem really confusing to us, and I don't believe that history repeats itself. I think every single historical moment is unique. And so we're not going to be able to understand what is happening right now by looking at what happened with President Lincoln or with the Civil War or with what happened in Watergate. But I do think it offers us a lot of parallels so that we can step back and tell ourselves we're not crazy, we're sane. Things like this have happened in the past. And so that's my goal in trying to discuss this. I'm just going to put this little note here on Twitter so people can see this history and what it tells us about the SCOTUS decision, U.S. and Byzantine history, because I think a lot of the history of the Byzantine Empire is probably going to be very helpful and useful for people as we start on this journey. Okay, so now that all that stuff is up there, let's first talk about what I said in my live stream yesterday. I made the point that the Warren Commission and Watergate, the Warren Commission was this commission that was headed up by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the time, Earl Warren, and this commission was appointed by John F. Kennedy's successor, Lyndon Baines Johnson, to investigate the assassination of JFK. And it was riddled with suspicion from the very beginning because Lyndon Baines Johnson had become president because John F. Kennedy was assassinated. So, of course, a lot of people were going to have lingering questions about whether, was Johnson in some ways, because he was benefiting from the assassination, did he have ulterior motives in trying to get the commission to give one report out and maybe not release all of the relevant details? The commission consisted of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Earl Warren. It also had the director of the CIA at the time. It had Gerald Ford, who would go on to become vice president and president, both under very sketchy circumstances under Nixon. And then it had a former president of the World Bank. So the Warren Commission was not exactly the most trustworthy body. And then they made the mistake of putting out this report where they really investigated and they interviewed witnesses for the most part, for the purpose of saying that all of the ulterior theories didn't have any basis, and this was just one lone gunman. He was crazy. Now, the reason why I brought up the Warren Commission and the assassination of JFK is not that I'm trying to compare this election to the murder of a president, but I am saying that the government has a history of trying to get one story out and trying to tamp down controversy and trying to discredit alternative theories about something that is really controversial, really meaningful and painful for the people. And over the long term, it doesn't work. And I think that's why we need to be hopeful about this to a certain degree, about our situation, because even if we can't stop Joe Biden from becoming president, and I'm sure that some people are going to continue to fight to stop him. I'm going to continue to fight to stop Joe Biden from becoming president with whatever we can. But let's just deal with the reality of what's going to happen if he does become the next president. I think over time, we can win the argument because just the force of the truth repeated over and over again. Now, one of the historical parallels that I think people have not looked at quite as closely, or I haven't seen it brought up, so I just wanted to bring that out there, was what happened when the Roman Empire actually fell. We often hear a lot of references to the fall of the Roman Empire, and there are parallels there that I think are useful here, because the Roman Empire didn't really fall per se in one fell swoop. There were events in 476 AD which caused the collapse of the western half of the Roman Empire. But there was another half of the Roman Empire which went on for another almost 1,000 years of history. That was known as the Byzantine Empire. They considered themselves the Roman Empire. They're often referred to as the Eastern Roman Empire. But what happened when Rome fell? There were basically two worlds, because there was this emperor named Diocletian in the late 200s who decided to split the Roman Empire into two realms of power. One would be in the east and largely Greek speaking, and that would have as its basis the city known as Constantinople later on. And the other half of the empire was going to be Rome itself, the city that had been the bustling center of the empire all that time. Why did Diocletian split power among two different cities? Because there had been so much turmoil about who was going to become the next emperor. The process of choosing the next emperor had become so fraught with danger in the 200s, in that third century of history. Rome's emperors, almost none of them lasted for more than 2 to 3 years. They were lucky if they got 3 years. They all got assassinated or killed or brought out in conspiracies. And there was no way for the system to correct itself. Everything had gotten out of control. The Senate in the West, in Rome, continued to meet all the way up until the 600s. It was, they had the shell of the earlier structure of Rome, but it had become meaningless because there was no way for the legal system and for the military and all of the different parties that had power in Rome to actually bring order back and to bring stability and to have things run the way they were supposed to run. So ironically, even though Rome, the city of Rome and the western half of the empire, which was Latin speaking and which was centered on Rome, even though that was the place where all the glorious history seemed to be centralized, that was the part of the empire that actually fell first. And when I say it fell first, it was 1,000 years before the other half of the empire fell. And so Diocletian in the late 200s, when he decided to say, okay, we're going to share power, there's going to be two people in the east and two people in the west, he thought that that would be a way of taking the heat off of the office of the emperor and making it seem as though if you became emperor, you didn't run this risk of getting murdered, and there wouldn't be all of this constant turmoil to try to pick who the emperor was going to be. So he thought that if they spread the power out between the two spheres, and if they had two in each capital, that then people could serve as emperor and not be terrified of getting murdered. Also, they had term limits that they tried to impose on it so that things would move more smoothly. What really ended up happening in the end was, after Diocletian came Constantine. Constantine made Christianity the official religion of the empire. There were ups and downs, but eventually the western half of the empire fell and the eastern half went on. I think the reason why this is relevant to our situation right now is that I don't know whether our situation necessarily needs to lead to civil war or whether it will lead to civil war. I am certainly open to the suggestion that we will have a civil war because there are many signs that that might happen at some point. But I think it's more likely that it's going to go the way of the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire, in the sense that the states that are now part of this election fraud conspiracy and the states that signed on against Texas and said that they support the right of states and local governments to make whatever election laws they want, even if they break laws, even if they create unequal protection of people's voting rights, etc. Those states are actually centralized in the parts of the country that are equivalent to the western half of Rome. In the Roman example, they had all the power, the attention. They represent Wall Street. Washington, D.C. itself is in that part of the country. Hollywood, Silicon Valley. I'm not going to say that it's the coastal places in the United States because, hey, look, Florida has a coast, South Carolina has a coast, Texas has a coast. It's more that these were centers for massive commercial power, legal power, because the Supreme Court obviously is located in Washington, D.C., and because we have Silicon Valley and the Hollywood that were located in L.A. and in the Bay Area. And then, of course, you have Seattle, where Amazon had a lot of ties, etc. So, but I think in the Roman example, you saw that the part of the empire that actually had the most power and the most money, the most glamour, was the side that fell first. So I think that what we're likely looking at is the United States is going to decline. I don't think there's any way we're going to be able to maintain the level of hegemony that we've had going forward. We're too internally divided. There's too much corruption for us to go forward. And unfortunately, one half of the country benefits from the corruption. And so they not only are never going to challenge it, they have gotten themselves into a mental state where they actually just don't believe that the corruption's there. They think this is the way things have always been and this is the way things should be. Then you have the half of the country that sees the corruption and that is suffering from the corruption. And I don't think these two halves are going to meet. The states that signed on to the Texas brief, that right there shows you that's one half of the American empire. The states that signed on with the defense of Pennsylvania, that's the other half of the empire. I think the half that was against the Texas case at the Supreme Court is the half that has a lot of the more prestigious institutions. They have a lot more of the people with fancy degrees. They have tended in the past to represent what American history was but a lot of the states in that coalition were part of the team that defeated the Confederacy in the Civil War and that ended slavery. So they have that kind of prestige, but just as happened in the Roman Empire, the more prestigious half actually falls first. I don't know why that happens in history, but it happened here. And I think that to the extent that we go forward, whatever solution America comes up with to try to keep these two halves of the country in some kind of functional state, if it's not going to be a civil war, whatever kind of arrangement we have, I think that the institutions that are already there, and that includes all of the things that the Constitution provided for, the Supreme Court, Congress, all of those are going to be similar to the Roman Senate after the western half of the Roman Empire fell. They will be there, they will go about their functions, but they're going to be increasingly irrelevant and ultimately powerless because they've lost all of their moral legitimacy. I don't think that anyone who lives in the red state world that is outraged over the election fraud, I don't think that there's any way for us to get over the fact that we just witnessed a massive crime, the ultimate worst possible crime, treason. That's what this is. When you steal an election, it's treason. And the fact that all of the levers of power were unable to stop it and couldn't correct it, and and all of the people who were part of the Fourth Estate, the newspapers and all of them, they just went along with it. There's no way for us to recover from that. So I think that we're headed towards a split that's similar to what happened in the Roman Empire. I suspect what I would think is that it's going to be similar, especially in the fact that I think Texas, which has taken this leadership of the other half of the country, I think that we will be actually more functional in the long term. I think we will be able to carry on much of the American tradition. We just won't have the strength and the power and the money that we had when we had the whole country on our side. So I think we're going to be much like the Byzantine Empire was, towards the end of the fall of Rome. Hey, Rachel, how are you? Well, Rachel.
Hey, doing good. Got my video working.
Oh, yeah, you got it? Okay, good. Well, Rachel, I'm glad you joined because, as you know the law stuff. I just went over the history of the fall of the Roman Empire, which I explained wasn't really the fall of the whole Roman Empire. It was the western half, the more prosperous, glamorous, famous half, the one that actually had the city of Rome. But the Eastern Empire, the Byzantine Empire, went on for another 1,000 years. And I was saying that that's kind of what I think is going to happen in the case of the American Republic, that the half of the country that is okay with this election fraud actually includes Wall Street. It includes Hollywood. It includes Silicon Valley, all of the tech stuff in Seattle. It includes Washington, D.C. So they have a lot of the prestige. They have a lot of the honor of having a lot of American history on their side, but they're the side, I think, that's going to collapse first. Just the way that in the Roman Empire, it was the Western half and it was Rome itself that collapsed first. Before I get to your legal opinions, what do you think of that theory that I'm putting out there, that they're going to collapse? Because if you look at those parts of America, the people who were in favor of this election fraud, I think that there's corruption everywhere, but I think that half has more serious critical weaknesses. I think that's the half where you're going to have riots a lot more. That's the half where you're going to have a lot more of just the dysfunction, the people not really sticking to Christianity, a lot of the peeling away from a lot of the moral center. And I think their dedication to American institutions is going to become increasingly empty. Whereas I think our half, for all of its problems, I think we have more of an opportunity to carry on and be functional, just because of the fact that at least on a moral and personal and individual level, we're more steady. And that is evidenced by the fact that we were the half of the country that realized that there was election fraud and that said something about it. What do you think about this analysis about the two halves of the country?
Oh, I love it. It's spot on, because our side is the side that's going to stick with upholding the law. And that has, served us well for, hundreds of years, since 1776. And so when we stick with the law and upholding the Constitution, then our country can keep going. But now we're out of power. Those of us who would stick with the law, we're powerless to control it. We can't stop the fraud. And I think the fraud is at such a level at this point that you're going to have a one-party monopoly. We're going to be run, essentially by an oligopoly. The wealthy elites with all the money and the power who are able to control these elections, they're going to be the ones. And you're right. They have no respect for the institutions that keep us from descending into anarchy. They've shown they're not going to stop the Antifa rioters. They've shown they're not going to stop, all this chaos and this, disrespect for the law. So it's just a matter of time. I mean, how long do you think until the U.S. is going to implode, and what is going to happen to us? For those of us who believe the Bible, there is no United States in the Book of Revelation. Where we disappear as a country, and I don't. Who knows what that means? What happens to us?
Yeah, I mean, I think you bring up a really good point, which is just the basic concept of the rule of law is not being upheld in the other half of the country. And when I say our half of the country, I live in Texas. Rachel lives in Arizona. We're the bread and butter. Okay, even though I'm Hispanic, I'm not white. It doesn't matter. We're the bread and butter of this half of the country. I would like to point out historically that Justinian was the emperor of Byzantium. He was the first emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire after the Western Roman Empire had basically completely collapsed. And he was the one who compiled the legal code. So talking about the rule of law, he is credited historically with taking all of the complex laws from the Roman Empire and putting them into one clear code. And so it's ironic that you should bring that up about the rule of law, because I think that we see that happening. When you ask how long we're going to last, I don't know if I'm not a prophet, so I'm just going to try to imagine what's going to happen. I think that we're going to see at some point an administrative split into two, that somehow the government is going to change its legal structure, or we're going to change our practices, or the state legislatures are going to be coming up with some kind of laws that are basically going to create a situation where our half of the country is operating in one way, the other half of the country is operating another way. We're going to gradually part ways, and eventually it will come to the point where we are effectively two separate countries. And the way that I would see that happening is there will be something like an Antifa thing where those uprisings or illegal immigration, some kind of huge trend, is really thriving in the other half of the country, and our half manages to keep control of it. This is very similar to what happened in Rome, because the barbarians, they got into Rome and they sacked Rome, and they sacked Rome and destroyed it when the eastern half of the empire managed to maintain its security. So I think that's what I would say in my crystal ball over the next 15 to 20 years. I think that ultimately it's going to be a slow, painful process. I don't think it's going to be a civil war that lasts 3 years. It's going to be slow and painful. I think it may result in armed conflict. And certainly in the case of Rome, when Charlemagne was crowned in 800 AD, when he was crowned the emperor of the Roman Empire, this was seen as an act of war against the Eastern Empire that was still there, because he was trying to reunite, the whole Roman Empire again. And it was clear that the East didn't want that. Okay, so that's an interesting kind of sideline. Now I want to ask you, what the heck is going on with the Supreme Court? I mean, I was basically of the mind that the legal battle is over. I said that on the live stream. I got some comments online from people who were chastising me and saying, no, ye of little faith, there is still more to fight. Is there anything left to fight? Rachel, just tell us the straight truth. Don't lie to us, okay? Tell us what is left in terms of the legal fight.
Yeah, you know me. I mean, I don't sugarcoat it, and I already had one of my subscribers to Intellectual Conservative tell me to F off and take me off of my mailing list because, somebody was posting something that he didn't want to hear. But yeah, I watched your whole podcast from yesterday, and I unfortunately think you are spot on. This is the end of the road. Basically, the Supreme Court had the best case in front of them. Say what you want. This was the strongest case, and we can get into that and go over the reasons why. If there was any case they were going to accept, it would have been this one. Everything after this is not going to make it up to the Supreme Court, or if it does make it up, it won't actually technically hear it. It's the Supreme Court is going to blow those cases off on some technical reason, like they did here. The argument for standing was incredibly strong. You had top scholars all around the country say that the Supreme Court had to take it, and so the fact that they punted. I've been lying in bed all night trying to think why they would punt it. I'm having worked for politicians and, been an appointed attorney for a politician. I have some inside knowledge of how the game works, but it's even beyond me. I don't understand these judges in the middle were appointed by Trump, but we already saw Gorsuch and Kavanaugh were already giving us a few decisions that were showing that they are not solid conservatives. And, there's always been this talk, and a lot of it's been by maybe Clarence Thomas and his wife. I don't know. Maybe it's just gossip going around, but that a lot of these judges care about the cocktail party circuit. And that's what it comes down to for them. It's not the principle. It's how they fit in, who they get along with. And, I've been saying this now for several weeks. Our side is terrified of being called conspiracy freaks, and we need to figure out how to refute that. The left is a genius at making us feel like we are idiots. And I'm sorry, if you are challenging election felony fraud that can change, the whole format of this country and, absolutely destroy us, you are not a conspiracy freak. And we've got to turn this around on them. And these judges are terrified of being labeled as fringe. If they're able to label somebody like Trump, who was a Democrat most of his adult life, he was a rhino New York Republican. If they're able to make him look fringe, they can make anybody look fringe.
Yes, and this, you're bringing up a point that, I hate to be like the history nerd, but it just matches so much what happened in the Roman Empire. That's why the Roman half, the Western half, was the one that fell first, was because all of the administrators and the bureaucrats and the senators, they were all living in that world. They were living in the environs of this city, and the social pressure on them was enormous. All the bonds through marriage and through having the same tutors and through having served in the same provinces or, being patronized by the same people. They couldn't cure their corruption because they were surrounded by it. And I think that's what happened with the Supreme Court in this case, regardless of whether even someone like Amy Coney Barrett, everyone loves to say, well, she is from New Orleans and she went to Notre Dame. It doesn't matter. They live in this Washington world that is, you can't, they get up in the morning, they have to go get their coffee. They have to have someone for their kids to play with. They have to drop their kids off at school. They have to talk to the neighbors. They're going to be under pressure. And there's no way around it. And there's no constitutional fix for this. That's what's so unfortunate. There's no constitutional fix. It's a cultural problem. John Adams said that this Constitution is only going to work for a religious and moral people. It won't work for anybody else. Do you think that's what's going on there, Rachel?
Yes, and you brought up a really good point when you mentioned Amy Coney Barrett. When I was at the stream, I wrote articles about the nominees as they came up, Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, and, who was being considered. And I did extensive research into all of their backgrounds, including Barrett's background, way back when we went with Gorsuch, the first one of Trump's nominees. And the thing that struck me about all three of them was they did not have a consistent conservative history. I didn't see, none of them jumped out at me and was like, oh yeah, there's another Clarence Thomas, there's a Robert Bork. They all had questionable things in their background. I remember with Barrett, the thing I noticed was she had no pro-life decisions. Now, she didn't have any necessarily pro-abortion decisions either, but she didn't have any record. We didn't know. And, anybody can join the Federal Society. I'm a former president of the Federal Society at the University of Arizona, and when I was in law school. And anybody can join that. Anybody can put that on their resume. I mean, if you want to get the right behind you, all you do is you say you're a member of the Federal Society, and you don't have to do anything to prove it, anything to show it. It's just a box you check for a lot of these people. And so I smelled a rat, and you might remember me talking about this, in previous days, but I was never confident that the Supreme Court was going to come down on Trump's side. I mean, I've been saying for days, I figured Trump had maybe a 30% at coming through. And, and part of that reason was because you don't know what's going to happen with the Supreme Court. Now, I got excited when Arizona Attorney General Mark Brnovich, who I know, jumped into the Texas lawsuit because he's a very calculating person, and he wouldn't have done that unless he thought that there was a chance. But maybe he was only talking to people who were getting through to Clarence Thomas and Alito because, obviously his calculation was wrong.
Right. You were right. I got to admit, you had all the right predictions on it. The Supreme Court, we can get lost in all of the legal debates and everything, but ultimately, I don't think that they're deciding it on the law. I don't think that they're applying legal reasoning. The truth of the matter is that we have a system of law in America where many things are decided by jury. It's a trial by jury. So ultimately, the legal system was supposed to make up or we're supposed to function based on the idea that just common sense, everyday experience allows you to be able to judge the facts of a case, right? So we were never supposed to be at this weird stage where we give so much moral authority to people who are in the legal profession. I mean, there's a reason why the founders of the United States did not want to move to that, because they knew the history of the Spanish Inquisition and of the Star Chamber in England. And when you give all of this moral authority to people who don't operate with transparency and don't have any checks on their power, they get out of control. So it doesn't surprise us that we got to this point. And I agree with you about the fact that these judges that we constantly look to as good appointments, there's always a knot in my stomach when I look at some of them, because I went to Yale, right? And so I know that the people who go to those elite schools, they're not necessarily better than the average person. What they are is they're much more socially tied in. And so they have a lot of vulnerabilities. to all of this pressure. We got a couple of questions here in the chat room. One guy says, you have no concept of law. Okay, GK, thanks for your feedback there. Scott Hupp asks, Seattle and Minnesota are just precursors of what the norm will be over the next decade? Question. And I would say, yes, I think that's what's happening with the creation of two legal realms. This is what's happening in America right now. We're creating two legal realms. Okay. And so what you're going to see is in places like Seattle and Minnesota, the fruit of that legal realm will very soon become visible. Right. And so I think that is what they're going to see in those areas. For those of us who live in our side and the people who want to live in the other realm, the one that said, yes, voting rights are sacred and you can't have election fraud and just let it go with all these technicalities. Right. The question is, how do we keep the other side's legal problems from infecting us? That's a good question I'll pose to Rachel. How do we preserve at least what we get from having a more stable legal structure?
Well, and that's where I'm more negative than you are, Bobby, because, you see these two different sides coming out of this, but I think it's worse. I think there's going to be nowhere for us to run. These blue people keep moving into our states and, running for office. And then they keep, corrupting our systems. I moved to Arizona in 1996 on purpose because I was so tired of how liberal Seattle was. And I've seen Arizona just basically start to turn purple, not because of the people, but because of the corruption. We knew in 2018 that we had voter fraud going on. A lot of the state went blue that year. And so it was a precursor of what happened. And so now look at Arizona now. We have 2 U.S. senators from Arizona are both far left Democrats. And don't try to tell me Kirsten Sinema is not far left, okay? She got the award for the Vladimir Lenin Award in the state legislature when she was in the state legislature because she was the most far left member of the state legislature. So don't let her new persona now fool you. But anyway, I think the Democrats are going to come into our red areas of the country and they're going to take us over illegally through fraud. I don't think there's any way to escape it. Do you really think Arizona's going to go back to being red? I think they won us over. They've gotten away with the fraud. And what you see in Arizona is a precursor of what's going to happen in other red states around the country, including Texas.
Well, I guess I'm just looking historically at some of these historical examples. Like I'll go back to Rome or ancient Israel. That's a good one. I'm telling people, please read the book of Judges because the book of Judges gives you a map in the Bible of what happens when you just depend upon one judge after another to come and save you from all of your problems. By the end of that book, you see what happens and how horrible it is by the time you get to the 19th chapter of Judges. But also in Rome, I think what ends up happening is as the system becomes more and more corrupt, and as people really start to realize that they're not going to be protected, that you live in a society where nothing really works, it's a slow erosion where eventually those institutions really do start to lose their power over people. And we're seeing that with the COVID lockdowns, where eventually they're just going to pass laws and people are just going to flout the laws and they don't care. And you're going to descend into, I guess, anarchy, or at least some anomie, maybe like a midway point towards anarchy. But that's the slow, steady erosion. And I think that once you're on that path, number one, it's very hard to turn it around. I think Justinian was able to turn it around in the Eastern Byzantine Empire. He had a couple people close to him, including his kooky wife that everybody accused of being a prostitute. But they were very savvy, and they managed to separate themselves from the intractable problems of the West. They managed to separate themselves from all of the problems that were happening in Rome, and to be able to make that at least Byzantium stable enough to carry on. That would seem like what it happens. Now, I'm going to ask Rachel, this is not so much a legal question, but a political question. Remember that the very first live stream we had, I said, this may come down to people trying to invoke that provision in the Constitution where they go to the Congress and get the Congress to block the certification of votes. Okay, so now people are talking about this. Now people are saying that we're going to, you know, and I'm totally fine with this. I will write letters, as many letters as people want. I will support people to do this. They're suggesting that we go to Congress and try to get Congress to block the certification of the votes from certain states so that Biden will dip below 270 and it will go to the House of Representatives. What do you make of that plan? Does it have any legs, and where do you think it's going to go?
Well, unfortunately, I don't think it's going to go anywhere, and that's why we haven't heard a lot of talk about it. Basically, because all the momentum is going the other way into upholding the election results, there's no way, even though Republicans control delegations from more states, so they would, you know, technically have more votes when it comes to that. You have so many wimpy Republicans in Congress. It's not even funny. We know how many rhinos there are. We know how many moderates are. I mean, just look at how many Congress members. I think we're up to like 128. That's it that we were able to get to sign on, you know, to this supporting this Texas brief. So that tells you right there, we don't have the numbers.
Oh gosh. Well, it's depressing, but I'm trying to, I want to support the people who are still keeping this fight up. I don't want to leave them hang, because I know what it's like to be hung out to dry. So I don't want to hang them out to dry. But I think I also want all of us to build up our plans for what we're going to do under a Biden presidency, if it comes to that, which it seems most likely that it is going to come to that, and what the future is going to look like for us. I think I can give you some historical background from the 1960s of what happened when the Republicans saw that the Democrats were deep in the mud with the assassination of JFK, because let's not forget, when JFK was assassinated, Lyndon Baines Johnson became the president. And so there were all of these people that were tied to Lyndon Baines Johnson. And there still is a very strong suspicion among many scholars that really LBJ and the Democrats were the ones who were behind the assassination of JFK. What did the GOP do at the time? Well, we got some of these rhinos. I don't know what they would call them back then, but they jumped onto the Warren Commission. They refrained from making any questions. They blocked everything in Congress right along with the Democrats. And you know how they were repaid for it? The 1964 landslide defeat of the Republicans when Goldwater, I mean, he was crushed by Johnson. Johnson, who, I mean, it's obvious that he had tons of weaknesses because he didn't even run for re-election, which he was entitled to do in 1968. He pulled out of the race in the middle of the race because he had so much dirt that he did not want to get out. So the Republicans knew that he was weak on all kinds of areas, but it's the same thing. They just went along to get along, and what they were repaid with was that massive defeat. And the 1964 defeat of the Republicans, this has allowed the Democrats to run around saying that the Republicans are racist, blah, 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 because what they did was they managed to get them all out of Congress. So the Democrats got to rush to the front of the parade and pass all of this civil rights legislation, when in fact the Democratic Party had been the one blocking it up until then. So, I mean, you're talking the cost of doing this, the cost of doing what the Republicans are doing right now is so astronomical. I cannot believe that they're going along with it. The Democrats are not going to repay any of these Republican turncoats in any way, shape, or form. The minute that this controversy has blown over, they will turn on them. They will call David French and Karen Swallow Pryor and Rod Dreher. They will call all of them bigots. They will drive them out of public life. It's like, you know, it's like Faust making a deal with the devil. I mean, ultimately, you're not going to get anything out of it. Do you see any positive future for the Republicans who went along with this?
No, of course not. And, you know, I know how these people work, okay, because I had to work with them in the past, and they're getting small favors, okay? That's what they're getting. They're getting little backroom deals behind the scenes. They're not getting anything major. So, you know, while they might think, oh, yeah, this Democrat's going to appoint me to this small position, you know, in the administration, you know, in the grand scheme of things, that's nothing. what happens when, that position doesn't work out after, a year and they resign and move on? They got nothing. I mean, they are done. The Democrats don't owe them any more favors after that. We've all seen history. We've all seen this happen. Look at Mitt Romney. He's out there like a lone wolf. What has he ever gotten from all his capitulation? Practically nothing. Maybe he'll get, a year administration post under Biden, but that's it.
Well, I want to thank you for joining us, as depressing as this is. Let me try to counteract what you're saying with a little bit of hope, I guess, with a little bit of, a cheerful little cup of coffee in all of this. I think that over the long term, I'm just going to rely upon our historical examples. I think we can turn this into a situation like what happened with the fall of the Roman Empire. We want to be the Byzantian. We want to be the Byzantine Empire that carries on for another 1,000 years on a smaller scale. Maybe we won't be as writ large and as famous as we were when we had Hollywood and New York. But I think an American republic that consists of the 20 states that sided with us on this. That's Texas, that's Oklahoma, that's Kansas, Nebraska. We have port cities, so we're not landlocked. We have Galveston, we have Pascagoula, Mississippi, and Pensacola. I think if we can find some way of gathering force on the half of the country that sided with this, and this is not the Confederacy. I want to point that out. Georgia and North Carolina are not with us. So this isn't like the Deep South versus the North. We have all the way up to the northernmost state of Alaska is on our side. North Dakota is on our side. We have a lot of people who are on our side. These were attorneys general or lieutenant governors, elected officials representing that state who put their name on that brief. So for all of the rhinos who have disappointed us, we have 21 states where clearly we stood the line, and hopefully we can find some way of having an economic system and a judicial system where we work with each other and we protect ourselves. I don't know if that sounds like I'm saying secede from the Union. I don't know what it is. There just had to be a way to do it. Okay, Scott Hupp has a comment, and I want you to respond to this, Rachel. He said Ohio had 96 representatives sign in, not just the Attorney General. What make you of that?
Well, I think that's just adds more, power to our argument. And I like what you said, Bobby, in your last podcast, where you said people need to keep, going ahead with trying to get these corrupt people prosecuted, even during the Biden administration, because, like the JFK situation, nobody believes the Warren Commission hardly anymore, years and years later after looking into it. No, that was a brilliant point you made. And I think that's where I think we can put our hope in, the fact that we can turn around, this trust that there was no fraud in the election.
Right, it does. And Scott Hupp, the one thing I'm going to say to you too is I hope that Ohio is part, if what I'm saying pans out and we end up having two Americas, I just hope that Ohio will be with us, because I think they are, okay, so Nick Kerr says, dude, they applied the law. You don't have legal training. Okay, Rachel, do you have legal training? He says you have literally zero qualifications to seriously comment on the Texas versus Pennsylvania et al. Lawsuit. Okay, Rachel, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, and one of your other commenters brought that up as well. Okay, let's go over my background. Okay, I was an assistant attorney general for the state of Arizona for 3 years. I was an appointed special assistant and deputy county attorney for Maricopa County Attorney's Office for 5 years. That includes being a prosecutor, and that included being the Maricopa County elections attorney. My favorite area of law is constitutional law, and that doesn't even include things like I was a corporate lawyer for GoDaddy, because that's probably not as relevant. So what about my legal training makes me not qualified?
I would say nothing of your legal training disqualifies you, but thank you very much, Nick, for your contribution. We really appreciate you joining the conversation. My thing is so it basically becomes a cultural and a political battle at this point. It becomes a social and a cultural and political battle. I do think the legal battle needs to continue, as both Rachel and I think, are on the same side with this, that we're not in this huge rush to stop this event in early January. So people have time to get subpoenas. They have time to have discovery. They have time to actually build substantial evidence and to have their case. We're going to have some trials that will have juries involved, won't they? And I think that if you have a trial by citizen jury, I think that the everything moves in our favor, because people who look at it from common sense, and they know that there are evil coworkers who will do things like steal a box of paper and swap it out for fake paper, right? They've experienced that in their own offices. I think that works in our favor. Does the jury system perhaps work in our favor as we try to just have civil and criminal cases for all of this?
I've read too many articles about juries. You've heard the statement: a good prosecutor can get a grand jury to indict a ham sandwich, and then you look at process crimes. Harvey Silverglate wrote a book called 3 Felonies a Day about how the average American commits 3 felonies and doesn't even know it, because we have so many vast, vague, especially process crimes on the books. So if you get all the money in the world and you're going to have, the Biden presidential team, probably the DOJ on the other side of a lot of these lawsuits, they've got unlimited deep pockets. So I don't even trust the jury system.
Right. Okay. Well, that's I'm trying to find little rays of hope in all this. I guess the biggest hope is, and I'll end on this note. The biggest hope is just that there were so many people who came out and who stood for this, and who said, we got to get to the bottom of this. We can't just let things slide. We can't just leave this stone unturned. We got to get to the bottom of it. And I think that we will form a community, and the community will continue on, because there's going to be more of these types of controversies where we're going to find that like-minded people tend to cluster on one side of it. And a lot of our names and faces are going to be familiar to each other in the years coming up. My model that I would plug for is the Byzantine model. We're going to be the Byzantine Empire of the American Republic. We're going to be the side that goes on in a kind of humbler and more low-key way, that did try to preserve all of the laws that came from the Republic. But at this point, and this is where I hate to sound depressing, but I've given up on the other half of the country. I don't think, I think that if you are conservative and you love American history and you love the Republic, if you're Christian, I think you need to move out of those states. I don't think there's any way that you're going to be able to build a viable life at this point. This is not just remote politics. This is now going to affect how they deal with the COVID lockdowns, whether your kids are going to be able to go to school, whether you're going to be able to keep your children, because the same corrupt legal process is going to infect family court. It's going to infect child and family services. It will infect the Board of Ed. It will mean whether you can get licensed. I think that we have to cluster as many conservatives as possible in the states where at least we have a fighting chance to preserve something that looks like the rule of law. But I've given up. I don't, I have all of my family that I was raised with. They all live in California and New York. And, I don't ever picture myself being able to move back to where I grew up. It's very sad. But I mean, would you ever move back to Washington? Would you ever go?
My parents are back there and my mom's health isn't good. So it's a possibility. And at least they don't live in Seattle proper, although they do live in a Democrat-controlled city. So it's not, ideal. But the one thing that I got to write an article about this. The left is now trying to spin it and saying, oh, you won't notice any difference when Biden's president. The average person, unless you're rich, it's not going to affect you. That is so not true. We saw so many things happen when Obama became president that we felt in our daily lives. This is going to be like Obama times 10. People don't realize, with Kamala Harris calling the shots and she being the most liberal member of the Senate, we are in for a whirlwind as conservatives. And I do think, it's worth it at least trying to get to a conservative area. Now, at least there are some pockets of resistance in the blue states. Like you probably heard, Mossy Rock, town of 1,000 in Washington state, my home state, is defying the lockdowns. And so they are, we're going to see more and more of this popping up. And there was an article in the Wall Street Journal just a couple days ago about how these protests are now popping up in blue states because there are so many people still stuck there that are sick of it. So, I mean, I'm not advising people to stay in blue states, but I agree with you. I think this is going to end in violence.
Well, if it does not follow the slow and gradual Roman model, if it becomes a question of secession and it becomes a civil war, then I would say don't betray the red counties that are in the blue states. In fact, yesterday or the night before, if you go down my Twitter timeline, my Twitter name is R Lopez Mission. If you go down, I did go and I researched the contact information for every red county in California and New York. And if you look at those, first, the land mass is enormous in, like, let's say New York, where I grew up. You had Niagara County, which was Niagara Falls, which they went 58% for Biden. I mean, for Trump. I'm sorry. I was really stunned by that. So you have, lots and lots of those places that if it becomes to secession, don't leave them out. We might be able to cobble together a bunch of that red territory into the country that comes out of this. Can you believe we're even talking about this? I mean, this is like, whoever thought that we would get to the point where this is like normal everyday conversation, but this is where we are,
Yeah, no, I have like respected conservatives talking about secession. And, the thing they don't realize is, this is really to a point where, Ulysses Grant, was saying, when the South was trying to secede, these are traitors. I mean, you've got one side calling the other side traitors at this point. The level of rhetoric has really escalated to a level that I never thought I would see in my lifetime, that's for sure. But, again, I mean, with all the violence going on, I mean, how can you not say that it's not going to happen? I mean, I don't know if we're necessarily going to go to a complete split, but I think we are going to see an increase in violence. And I think you're going to see a huge increase in civil disobedience. I mean, the town of Mossy Rock, that's just a town of 1,000. But, with the lockdowns, Democrats are going to keep that going. Bill Gates has said till not even this next summer, but the summer after that. That's a lot of time for a lot of civil disobedience. And, with Biden and his 100-day, mask requirement that he's going to set up as soon as he gets into office, I mean, it's just stoking the fires.
Well, one last question, and then I'll let everyone go off and enjoy their Saturday afternoon. Scott Hupp asks, is there any truth in Obama being a major player still? I don't know. I don't have any information on that. I assume that certainly the people who are backing Obama and his allies, I'm certain, are thoroughly involved with all of this because it's the same circle of people, the Obama, Bidens, and Clintons. So, all right. Well, thank you very much, Scott, for joining us. Thank you to Rachel, and we will keep everyone updated as much as we can. My Twitter handle is R Lopez Mission. Rachel's is, could you give them your Twitter handle?
It's Rach_IC, and I keep telling everybody now, you got to go to the alternative sites as well. So I'm just going to start telling everyone, find me on Parler, and I'm also on Gab as well.
All right. Thank you, everybody, and have a great day.